on to Dr. Dale Hatfield. Dale Hatfield is currently a senior fellow at the Silicon Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship, and an adjunct professor in the Interdisciplinary Telecommunications Program, both at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Prior to joining the university, Hatfield was the Chief of Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC, and immediately before that, he was the Chief Technologist for the agency. He retired from FCC and the government service in December 2000. Before joining FCC in December 1997, he also was the CEO of Hatfield Associates Incorporation. Before founding the consulting firm in 1982, he was the acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and acting administrator of the National Telecommunications Information Administration. Before moving to NGA, Hatfield was the Chief of Office of Plans and Policy at the FCC. He has about 50 years of experience in telecommunications policy and regulation, spectrum management, and related areas. He has been almost there everywhere, and he knows it all. He holds a BS in electrical engineering from the Case Institute of Technology, MS from Industrial Management from Purdue, and he also has an honorary doctorate. Please welcome Dr. Dale Hatfield.
Thank you, Rangam, for the very kind introduction. I'm just getting over a cold, so if my voice is a little raspy, that explains it. But I really do want to thank everyone who give me the chance to be here and talk a little about interference resolution and enforcement within the bigger context, if you will, of the subject matter of the workshop, using data and monitoring to improve spectrum utilization. Before I jump into my remarks, I think it may be important to distinguish, because it confused me for a while, between a more passive, ideally longer-term spectrum monitoring aimed at measuring spectrum occupancy for the primary purpose of identifying underutilized or inefficiently used spectrum, and B, more active real-time spectrum and direction-finding measurements that are aimed primarily at detecting, identifying, and locating interference sources for mitigation and enforcement purposes. I'm going to be focusing on the latter of the two, but one of my messages, of course, when we think about monitoring for the prior purposes, we also think about the monitoring for enforcement as well. When I sat down and scribbled some notes as what I might say this morning, I thought I would lay out a few hypotheses that I think are true and kind of build on those. I won't have time, but I will go through a couple of the things I think that may be obvious to you, but I think I'll go through them anyway. And my sort of first hypothesis or premise is that the United States is experiencing explosive growth in wireless devices and systems that successfully must operate not only in increasingly close proximity to one another in the frequency, space, and time domains, but also to other electrical and electronic devices that unintentionally or incidentally emit or are susceptible to electromagnetic radiation. You may have read recently some of the problems they're having with the electronic ballasts and light fixtures causing interference to nearby small cells. Well, that's sort of a new, to me anyway, a new sort of interference thing that we would not have been thinking about not very long ago. And of course, as we all know, that densification is being produced by a whole bunch of different things: the need to increase capacity, the need to reduce guard bands, the need to take advantage of take advantages of gaps in time to get temporal efficiencies. And of course, as I'm saying, I think this increased densification really increases the risk of disruptive and harmful interference. So my first hypothesis or premise is that there is continuing growth and demand for spectrum, nothing new there, that is producing increasing densification, which in turn increases the risk of disruptive and harmful interference, or at least harmful and disruptive interference of a different type than we're normally associated with dealing with. My second hypothesis or premise is that the increased value of the radio spectrum resource will put pressure on both the FCC and the NTIA and other government agencies, like to my right here, to appropriately protect this radio resource and in particular to be able to more quickly and effectively resolve cases of interference when they do arise. And of course, the latter is especially true for services that are critical not only to our economic and social well-being, but the public safety, homeland security, and national defense. More specifically, in terms of the PCAST recommendations, going back to Mark a bit, the immediate prospect of increased sharing of spectrum between and among federal government and non-federal government controlled devices and systems creates new challenges in terms of the institutional relationships and processes that are used to detect, identify, locate, mitigate, and report on interference incidents. These challenges have been exacerbated by the wider availability of illegal devices capable of jamming or otherwise disrupting wireless systems that are part of the nation's critical infrastructure. It's one of the things that caused me to lose a lot of sleep at night is this issue of intentional jamming. So it speaks to the importance of enforcement and to measurements in support of enforcement. Okay, clearly, the value of dynamically shared spectrum to commercial entities depends upon the processes and resources spectrum managers have available to reduce the number of incidents of harmful interference, and B, to resolve them quickly when they do occur. Similarly, the willingness of the federal government agencies to share larger amounts of spectrum in more dynamic ways depends upon their confidence that the applicable rules, regulation, contracts, and memorandum of understanding regarding such sharing will be effectively enforced in a timely manner. In other words, I really buy into the PCAST vision, but ultimately it's the willingness or incentives, to use your term, incentives, depend upon trust. Mm-hmm. Because I, as an investor, will be hesitant to invest in spectrum if I have doubts about whether I will be protected adequately from interference. And certainly if I'm in a national agency that has homeland defense sort of responsibility, my willingness to share is going to depend upon my trust that the enforcement part, my enforcement part will work. Mm-hmm. So we got to make sure that we have the appropriate tools and the appropriate processes for quickly and effectively resolve cases of interference when they arise. As I say here in my notes, and I've underlined it, to do otherwise will undercut the very basis upon which increased sharing called for in the PCAST report rests. I'm going to run out of time, so let me just touch on a couple of other points in more summary fashion. Once this is a classic two-edged sword, I see on the one hand this marvelous new technology that's doing all these things to make things much more dynamic, to be digital with changing waveforms, all these things that are such magic things going on. But all of those tend to complicate the enforcement. I mean, the old days when I have some friends here from the Enforcement Bureau at the FCC, And pretty straightforward. You found that really high antenna that was sticking up out there. It was running at high power. You could DF on it from a great distance. And they were really nice to you. They even, every so often gave their call letters, so you knew who they were, And moreover, they used what, AM and FM. So there wasn't too many modulation waveforms you had to choose from. But put yourself just for a moment in the seat of the FCC's fan today with these changes that are going on. You're dealing with these myriad of waveforms. People are jumping around. The interference may be much more transient. In many services, we don't have anything like call letters anymore. Those were kind of handy, But that leads to another point that I'll make in a moment. But so on the one hand, we have these challenges, but on the other hand, we have these same tools can be applied in ways to help us on the enforcement side. I know John Chapin in the back here somewhere. John. I believe, John, you were the person who had this brilliant idea. I think it's brilliant that we have handsets going around that have a lot of processing and storage capability. Why don't they store the last minute or two of the INQ information in the receiver, and you would put it on a loop. And if you had an interference incident, what you would do, you would stop, save that. And then you would go through a post-processing thing where you could take a look and say, okay, my call dropped repeatedly at a certain intersection. Other people's calls dropped. Let's take a look and find out what's going on there. These are the sort of things that weren't possible before. I'd like to talk a little bit more about big data and some of those things, but I don't think I have time. But my point is very simply, that the technology, wonderful technology that we're seeing is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's enabling us to do really, really sophisticated things, which presents problems. On the other hand, that same development in technology are giving us some tools that we didn't have before that we can apply to the enforcement problem. And let me. Sometimes I feel like I'm on a soapbox a little bit, but let me say, one time it was incentives. We're not going to have sharing unless we have the incentives right, and that's good. I see we're making there. And of course, I've been on receivers, having to do something about receivers since almost the start of my career. And I guess right now, my comment is that we need to bake in enforcement at the time we create rules and systems. Enforcement can't be an afterthought. What you need, right, is you need hooks in to be able to do the sort of interpretation of finding out what sort of things have gone wrong. Too often, what happens is we make rules for a new service and then hand them to the Enforcement Bureau saying, okay, we've done our work, go enforce it. Well, like I say, that may be difficult today because unless there is some ability to identify who the bad guy is and so forth, you're going to have a tough time doing your enforcement function. So when we talk about 3.5 gigahertz and so forth, we need to think early and strongly about what we're going to do to make sure that enforcement is done properly. Because if it doesn't, it undermines this trust that I'm talking about. If we can't make it work. Okay, I think let me make one final observation. I will stop, I promise. I've been doing some work in the last few months and then in preparation for this conference. And what I'm learning is that there is an enormous amount of monitoring data already being collected by people. For example, all the carriers do extensive drive tests for very good reason, because they want to know where their coverage is, and they even might want to know where the coverage of their competitors are, so they can do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
The tower companies, what do? They do extensive drive tests because they want to know where would be a good place to put a new tower. And of course, there's specialty. I think you're in the room. What is it? EESS, the satellite sensing. They do extensive measurements too. So when I look around, there's all this information, but it looks to me like it's all being collected in what? Silos.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are opportunities. I believe there are opportunities using sort of the big data thing gets a little flaky, but I do believe there's a real element of truth there. We have an awful lot of information that we're not fully taking advantage of. And then secondly, as we think about what we want to do in the future in terms of occupancy type measurements, we ought to think about what we can sort of tag along and do in terms of enforcement as well. So let me